today's Fireside Chat with Jesse. I am joined today by Jim Jackson from the Alta Group. Jim, thanks for joining me, man.
Jesse, I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me to attend one of these. I've been looking forward to it for a little while and really appreciate you having me.
No, I mean, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day. And, for the people who don't know you in equipment finance, Jim, if you could just kind of talk about your career, if you don't mind, sir.
Sure, be happy to, Jesse. Basically, I started in 1986 at a small company called Signal Capital Corporation. I was actually part of the Henley Group and was located in Hampton, New Hampshire. Signal was interesting in that my very first job there, and I really started at the bottom of the totem pole, I was a cash application clerk. So back before ACH and everything else, we'd get in checks from customers and someone had to take all those checks and post them to the individual accounts of each lessee. And believe it or not, I stuck that out for a year at Signal, and then an opportunity came up to become a business analyst.
Okay.
And that role was a little more involved, where it involved doing the pricing, reviewing the files just before they were ready for funding, involved completing the commission programs and the like. And so I applied for that position and got that position, and that was an exciting role. And the thing that I really liked about Signal, and there were only a handful of companies doing this in these days, but what was interesting is they had a formal training program, and they would take about a dozen people, myself included, and you'd learn the sales role, the credit role, documentation, customer service, collections, and you'd actually do those functions as part of this training. And it was incredibly valuable because you got to learn a lot about the business in a 3 to 4 month period of time. And I can't imagine how expensive that was, but certainly a fantastic learning experience. And everyone that went through it really, really raved about the process. And if you think about where that adds value, you got a sales rep out in the field and the credit person's calling saying, hey, I need a delivery and acceptance certificate before I can fund this vendor. They know exactly what that document is, and they know why the credit person needs it. And it really made for a much smoother process. But that was certainly a real benefit coming out of Signal. And the other thing that was helpful is I had gone about as far as I was going to go in my career, and the controller came and told me, look, if you want to advance further, you have an undergraduate degree, but you need to go back and get your MBA. And Signal said, we'll pay for your books, your tuition, your lab fees,
nice.
your software. And that was a real benefit back in the day because I couldn't have afforded to go on myself. So was actually very fortunate to come out of Signal with an MBA as well. Signal itself sold to Fleet Bank in the early 90s. And Fleet Bank offered me a job, but unfortunately what came with that is I would have had to have left southern New Hampshire and moved to Providence, Rhode Island to be closer to Fleet Bank because that's what the leasing company was. And I just wasn't ready to do that at the time. So I joined AT&T Capital Corporation in the leasing services business unit as the strategic business planner. And that was actually located in Framingham, Mass. Part of my role there, or a big part of the role there, was actually doing all of the budgeting, forecasting, variance analysis work for our division, which was about a $2 billion division at AT&T Capital. It was, a mix between small ticket and mid ticket transactions, some of them vendor, some of them direct to end user, and so forth. But what also came with that position was the fact that we did a lot of work with manufacturers and resellers in terms of setting up joint ventures, private label programs, and the like, with a bunch of different manufacturers and so forth. And what was interesting is at one point during my career at AT&T Capital, I was part of the support team where we went to Dell Financial Services and actually went to Dell to set up Dell Financial Services, and competed against Newcourt for winning that transaction. We also, within the same month, went to Compaq Computer, which is now HP in Houston, and then lastly we went to Gateway Computer, which was out in Sioux City, Iowa. But at Dell, what was very interesting is, we met with Tom Meredith, who was the CFO for Dell, in addition to meeting with Michael Dell. And he shared with us his strategy, which I thought was very impressive. What some people may not know is at the time, Dell was a build to order type of system where you would go online and you would pick basically the components that you wanted. You'd pick out the hard drive, you'd pick out the processor, you'd pick out the monitor, and then you'd send in a check, and then they would, from that ticket, build your PC. As opposed to Compaq and Gateway, where they built the PC, it sat on a retailer's shelf for maybe 60 or 90 days and was then sold. And so what Tom Meredith described to us is, he said, our strategy is really all about the fact that component prices continue to fall and become cheaper. So while my competition built the box 90 days ago, that's just today's selling, they're making less margin than me, who gets paid up front. I have just-in-time inventory. I build and sell that box today. And so far, my strategy has been to keep the higher margin, but at any time I want, I can go back out and undercut my competition, still make an acceptable return at any time I feel like it. And so that was interesting. I took away from that the fact that, that's a real strategy. That's a real differentiating strategy. And as I thought about the leasing industry at the time, all of the large companies that I had worked for had the same strategy. They all said, well, we're going to provide excellent service, and we're going to charge a premium price for that excellent service. And I thought, that's not really a differentiating strategy. These types of strategies, and especially a finance strategy, is truly a differentiator. So took that and kind of stored it away for later in life. Unfortunately, our group did not win the Dell Financial Services bid. That went to Newcourt. And then shortly thereafter that, as most people know, Newcourt actually acquired AT&T Capital as well, and my division along with it at Leasing Services. Newcourt, quite frankly, funded the entire operation through securitizations, at least in our division, where we basically booked transactions for 90 days and then they securitized them. And back in those days, it was off-balance sheet securitization. So it was literally the assets were sold. So if you looked at our P&L, we'd lose money because of the SG&A and overhead for 2 months. And then in the third month, we'd have a slight gain. And then we'd go back to 2 more months of losses. And I just didn't feel comfortable with that strategy. This was around the time of the Russian debt crisis. Securitization rates were on the increase. And I said, one of these times, the rates are going to go upside down on us and aren't going to work. So I made the decision to leave Newcourt, and myself and 2 other individuals co-founded Deutsche Financial Services Technology Leasing Group, which was a startup technology leasing group that was owned by Deutsche Bank. And that was just a fantastic learning experience with respect to a blank sheet of paper. We developed our own strategy and went to work, really RFPs out to all of the software platform providers and so forth. And we kept in mind the strategic aspect of the business, where we said, look, we have a great sponsor in Deutsche, big checkbook, wants to do this right. And how can we differentiate ourselves? So again, this was approximately 1999. And we said, there's this thing called the internet. What if we set it up so that vendors and customers could come in with an application, enter the information into our application site, have the document auto-populate the payments, the funded amount, run it
Right.
through a Fair Isaac scoring model, and have a risk-adjusted pricing. And when all of that was done and completed, email that back to the vendor. Of course, there were no e-docs in those days or anything like that, but that's as far as we could go. And so that's what we actually built. And we use that for transactions under 25,000. For transactions over 25,000, we still wanted a second pair of eyes looking at it to make sure everything was on the up and up. But we actually got that working and built the portfolio to probably about 350 million. And then Deutsche Bank came back in and said, well, we really don't want to be in the leasing business. So we're going to sell the company to GE and go from there. So once again, company sale kind of does us in. I left Deutsche and actually went to work at that point in time for Microfinancial Time Payment, micro ticket finance company in the Boston, Massachusetts area. A lot of startup equipment finance businesses, so forth. Restaurants, spas, fitness centers, and the like. And a big part of the business back then when I first started was the credit card swipe machines, where the old style boxes where you'd slide your credit card through that were used by restaurants and a number of other organizations. The thing that attracted me to Microfinancial Time Payment, although it was small ticket and a smaller organization than what I'd been used to, is it was publicly held. And I wanted to have that skill set on my resume that I was a CFO for a publicly held company, thinking it sounded rather nice and not necessarily realizing all the work that went into it with the SEC filings, the investor road shows, and all the work that's associated with that. There's a reason that that's a interesting job. But anyway, joined Microfinancial Time Payment. The company had really bet on some bad products, let's say, in the portfolio. And when things started to go sideways, they did what a lot of management teams do. They doubled down and said, let's just do more of it and we'll dig ourselves out of the hole. And that, of course, didn't work. So some of the new management, including myself, was brought in, try to restore investor confidence, square things away. We were able to do that. We were able to take the organization, despite all its difficulties, square away the portfolio, and actually grew the stock price to a little over $10. And we were actually acquired by Fortress Investment Group, which worked out well. So, the board was ready to sell. We were ready to sell. I think the timing was right, and we sold to Fortress. And at that point in time, I know Fortress wanted to take the business really in a direction that I wasn't comfortable with. So shortly after the sale, I resigned and took a little break from the industry, so to speak. And then of course the folks at Alta reached out to me and said, look, you know a lot of folks in the industry, a lot of people. Bruce is getting ready to retire, which Bruce is still around, so I don't know how close he's ready to retire now. And they said, would you like to come and run the merger and acquisition advisory practice for the Alta Group? And I said, you know what, sure. So jumped on with Alta, and the rest is history.
So thanks for that introduction there, Jim. If you don't mind, just for those people that might not be familiar with the Alta Group, maybe they've been living underneath a rock, do you mind just kind of introducing, that line of business for us?
Sure. So the Alta Group is a consulting advisory practice. It's global in nature. We have offices in North America, Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. We are a 70 consulting organization, and essentially we focus exclusively in the equipment finance and leasing industry. We have a number of different practice areas that include everything from strategy and competitive alignment, which also has a digital advisory aspect to it.
Right.
We have an asset management practice that focuses on equipment appraisals and the like. We have a legal practice that can help with documentation or legal issues that clients may have. Business quality assessment organization practice, which is essentially due diligence or a quality of earnings area where companies that are thinking of acquiring another company or banks that may want to do a field exam would reach out to.
Right.
And then, of course, the merger and acquisition advisory practice that I'm the practice leader of, where we provide buy-side and sell-side advisory for mergers and acquisitions. Essentially a full service consultancy for virtually anything you would want to do in an equipment finance and leasing organization.
So what did that do? I guess, it's almost been going on for a year now. From a project perspective, were you on the road traveling a lot, or did you do the majority of stuff virtually?
Well, there was some sort of good news, bad news with the pandemic. The good news is we all worked from home prior to the pandemic, so
Yeah.
Luckily we all had the tools and technology that we were used to and could continue to use, and in some instances we even improved upon during the pandemic to improve things. But and you and I have talked about this in the past, especially for new clients. And especially in my practice in the merger and acquisition advisory, there is no substitute for being able to sit across from a potential client, look them in the eye, have a conversation with them. And if you think about the M&A practice in and of itself, obviously buyers want to meet with sellers, sellers want to conduct a formal due diligence on site.
Absolutely. I mean, that's sensitive for both parties. And if you're sitting there and you built this baby up, for lack of better terms, and you're going to be selling it to somebody, if you don't get that good feeling, or if you don't like the handshake or something,
Exactly.
like, yeah,
Exactly.
I get it.
So, there is no real substitute, and obviously, regardless of the practice, it's always best if you can get in front of the client. It's a little less effective if you're sending over a report and even getting on a Teams call and discussing it. So a little bit of disruption, not being able to travel. Certainly, we're hoping that the second half of 2021 things will start to free up with the vaccinations and with the stimulus and some other things going on. We're hoping things get back to more of a normal, and we at least get the senior executives back into the office and not working from home, so that they can meet with prospective sellers or other buyers, as the case may be. So hopefully things will get back to normal soon, because it has impacted at least some of our practice areas.
Yeah, I would think that maybe some of those projects that weren't happening or that were about to happen maybe got put on hold. And then I guess I'm going to pivot to the next question I have for you. Now, as far as those mergers that are happening more recently, I guess, with these banks, what do you think's going on there? Why is that happening, Jim?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So I just finished up an M&A article for one of the industry publications, and a couple of things are going on. So let me start with a lot of the equipment finance company mergers and acquisitions, because there were several. For example, you had Regions acquiring Ascentium earlier in the year. I think a lot of the work for that was actually done really in just pre-pandemic. But you also had folks like Solar Capital buying Kingsbridge Holdings. I had a conversation with Vlad Gutin, who is with TZP Capital, and he actually said that process was facilitated because Solar had actually been a funding source to Kingsbridge Holdings and was actually very familiar with the management team and how the portfolio was operating both prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic. So quite frankly, some of these mergers took place because there was that insight. So it basically took the place of getting to know the management team, getting to, know how the portfolio would perform because they were already had firsthand knowledge. But with respect to the banks, we've seen a lot of the regional banks merging lately. Just recently, PNC with BBVA USA. We saw, for example, Huntington is acquiring TCF Capital.
Right.
And actually TCF Equipment Finance actually just went out and bought the small ticket portfolio of $1 billion from BB&T, which is part of Truist now.
Yeah.
So interestingly enough, I guess Huntington's going to inherit that shortly once that merger goes through. But, a lot of these banks that are regional in nature, they've basically come out and said it. They need to become larger. They need access to deposits. They need economies of scale so that they can compete with their national rivals. And a lot of them are making huge investments in digital platforms, and there's a high cost associated with the regulatory and compliance requirements for being a bank. So you add all those things together, and I think we're going to see a lot more of these regional mergers, especially now that the pandemic is subsiding a little bit, because these smaller organizations have to find a dance partner. And the question will become, what happens with those underlying equipment leasing companies that belong to these various regional banks that are now merging with maybe merger of equals or even a larger partner along the way. Similar to what we saw with the BB&T portfolio. For example, yesterday's news was, People's United Bank being bought by M&T in an all-stock transaction. What does that mean for People's Capital? What does it mean for Leaf? What does it mean for VAR or for Venlease that operates under?
Right.
Are these organizations that the merged entity will want to keep, or might we see portfolios for sale, or might we see lift out teams coming out of those organizations where they look for a new sponsor?
Well, and it's also, I think, some of those independents, well, maybe not independents, but even those people like Joe Pucci, who left, and then he went and, like you said, forklifted up his team and went over to Meridian and started over again. Same with the guys at Atlantic Union. I mean, I want to say there was a solid handful of startups in the last 18 months who, never know.
Yeah, that's what happens, and it's no fault of the sponsor necessarily or the company. It's just interests change, risk profiles change, and a lot of times these people have built their companies on relationships that they have, and it's their life's work, and they say, I need to find a sponsor that wants to do this type of business. So lift outs are fairly common because of that.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the compliance costs and everything else. I mean, I've been a service provider for 17 years in equipment finance, and I know what our costs are as being a service provider to get the SOC reports, pen testing, and everything else. So, can only imagine.
Yeah, it's expensive, and what I call a tweener bank is someplace that you don't want to be. Large enough that you're not a little community bank, but not so big that you don't have economies to scale, and that's just a recipe for a slow death in my mind. You really need to find a dance partner, become larger, and get those economies and scale and access to deposits.
So I guess that being said, do you anticipate this trend to continue for?
I would suggest if anything, I think it's going to accelerate.
Really?
Because the results of the pandemic, I think, hindered some of that. Okay. So I expect now that some of them are out, and of course, the more that happen, perhaps the fewer opportunities there are. So no one wants to wait for the music to stop. I think we're going to see more of that, especially with the regionals. In terms of them needing and wanting to get larger.
Well, and it wasn't just the banks that are doing it. I mean, IDS acquired William Stuckey last week. I mean, that was an interesting acquisition because that gets them into some of that asset-based lending
and the factoring. Correct.
And then Dominion was acquired over the weekend. So It's happening on the software side too. So
Yep.
maybe it's just not related to banks.
Expanding the wallet share, if you will. Yes. Yep. No, so that's definitely the case. I do expect to see more of that, and it'll be interesting as we said. What's the dynamic for those underlying leasing companies? Is it a business as usual type of environment, or might there be changes coming as a result of those mergers?
Well, I think they always say initially nothing is going to change, business as usual, and then you get legal day one, and maybe it's a little something different.
Correct. That's the usual tagline, right? Let's get them at least in the door, and then we'll decide what happens from there. Correct.
Well, the good thing is like people like yourself, they've been in the industry for a long period of time. They've done the right things, even if that isn't the case. Once legal day one hits, it doesn't take them very long to find their next opportunity in equipment finance. That's for sure.
Yeah, it really doesn't. And I think it might even be a little bit healthy for the industry from time to time for some of these banks to shed some of these groups. They tend to form through lift outs. They're, the new crop of independents, if you will, that grow up and find a niche and don't necessarily need the low cost of fund that the bank affords, or necessarily that regulatory environment that the bank affords, to allow them to kind of grow their own businesses. And I think that's a healthy part of the cycle in terms of equipment financing, getting that crop of independents and entrepreneurs out there who want to grow something on their own and grow it up to a point where it again attracts interest from the banks and PE firms.
No, you're absolutely correct there, Jim. So just kind of wrapping up here, a little fun fact about yourself, if you don't mind.
Sure. See, a fun fact.
Besides your Massachusetts accent.
That comes with the territory. Well, I'll say this. I guess it's kind of a fun fact. I've had my private pilot's license since I was 17 years old. My dad is retired Delta pilot, so you don't grow up in a Delta family without learning how to fly and getting your license at the earliest age possible. But I do still go up. I have a small little 1946 Air Coupe. I think you can drive down the highway faster than it can fly, but it is a fun plane to just go up from time to time, and it's kind of refreshing and helps clear your mind a little bit in terms of having some fun, and it's a nice hobby to have.
How often do you get to do that?
Probably a little more so in the summertime. The 46 Air Coupe is open cockpit, so it's kind of a seasonal flying thing.
I would say, unless you live here in Arizona, then you might.
Unless I lived in Arizona, but in New England, it's seasonal. No. I can assure you. Today would not be a good day for the Air Coupe. So yeah, in the summertime, fairly frequently, which is kind of interesting, and I tend to take my friends up from time to time who tend to hang around the airport looking for a free ride. But it's fun to go up with people and have fun with that.
Well, thank you for that. And then, it's how I kind of wrap these things up. So why, of the different consulting agencies in equipment finance, why the Alta Group, Jim?
Yeah, I'd say a handful of things really attracted me to the Alta Group. The first one was when I was with AT&T Capital, we actually used the Alta Group for some of those engagements that we had, and they were actually instrumental at placing me as one of the founders at Deutsche Bank to create Deutsche Financial Services. But on top of that, and I may be biased, but I really view them as the industry leader in equipment leasing and financing. They have great brand recognition throughout the industry. I think most people would agree with that their reputation precedes them. And the other thing that attracts me, although a lot of the US-based companies have sort of retracted, it is a global company, and we have global locations. And I think as time goes on, some of the US companies will get back to looking at maybe having international operations again. I think that might be more of a trend that we see in the future. and the fact that, you know, it's just a great group of people, a great group of principals. It's principals only. So a lot of the folks that are at the consultancy have actually worked at equipment finance companies. They've been senior executives. They've been on the front lines and have faced many of the same issues that, you know, we're trying to resolve at the Alta Group, because they've lived them, they've fixed them before in their own companies, and they have that experience level, unlike some traditional consulting companies which can consult, but they've never been operators.
It's like,
So
tell me a day in my life. Well, this is what I think, and then you guys are like, this is what we know. So
yeah,
that's definitely.
and what we've done in the past, correct, in our own situations, and I think that's helpful. It's something I think that differentiates us in the marketplace, and you know, all of us have, you know, worked in the industry a long time and really appreciate the industry for what it's done for us, and think it's a great little business. So.
Well, and that's kind of one of the things that I'm making sure that as we're doing these firesides, and you've kind of seen them in the past, it's whatever you put in the industry is what you kind of get out of it. And I think that kind of rings true to pretty much everything. I mean, you mentioned earlier your journey through your first organization, and I've seen that before. I think DLL, Great America, does that too, where they put you in teams, and it's like, okay, this is how a transaction flows from this to this, and then you kind of see what your ladder of successful in your career is going to be in equipment finance.
Right. Agreed.
Awesome.
Agreed. I think it's important to get that education early on. It just opens your eyes to a lot of different facets within each of the companies.
No. Well, thanks again for taking the time to talk to me today, Jim. Look forward to, hopefully maybe we can see each other. I'm hearing September, maybe.
September would be great. Look forward to that. It'd be great to.
Warmer there in Boston, but I'm not gonna get
Will
out.
Be. Sounds good, Jesse. I really appreciate you having me on today. Thank you for that.
No problem, Jim. I'll look forward to talking with you soon, sir. Thank you very much.
See you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.